Hi everyone, welcome, thanks for attending. Let me introduce Agneta to you. She's one of my favorite psychologists and one of the nicest collaborators I've been working with. We've only started recently working together. She's done loads. It's impossible to sum up in a couple of seconds, but she's held a professorship of the Beauvoir's Foundation, which probably tells you a little bit about her gender work, and currently she's holding a professorship at University of Amsterdam related to emotions and affective processes. Let's hear from her, and she can talk for herself.
Okay, thank you very much for inviting me and for attending, because I know that normally the colloquia are at the end of the afternoon, and I had the flight back at 6, so I'm very happy that you are all here. I sort of checked the background of different people in the department. I know that there is a huge variety of different people, neuroscience to social psychology. So I'm not sure whether everything I will tell you makes sense for everyone, but when there is any question, just raise your hand and please feel free to interrupt me at any time. So I will be talking about negative emotions in intergroup relations. And I mentioned the word extreme here, and that will be part of the talk, but I will not be only talking about extreme emotions, and I will explain what they are. So if we talk about intergroup relations, it often is about intergroup conflict. And we don't need to go very far to talk about intergroup conflict. They are everywhere. They're pervasive. They are in the Netherlands, in the Ukraine, in the UK, in Israel, etc., etc. So it's not a very amazing observation that there are lots of emotions in those intergroup conflicts. The question is actually what their role is. And so the question is, what do emotions do in intergroup conflicts? And can we actually experience emotions as part of a group? Can we experience an emotion if we are not ourselves being unjustly treated, for instance, but only our group? And so I will talk a little bit about these group type of emotions in intergroup settings, and we'll try to sort of go into why they would emerge, what would be their causes, how they are different from individual emotions, and what they do. So in a sort of overview, I will talk about the differences between different individual and group emotions. I will talk about, well, there are 3 routes, but I will mainly talk about primitive emotional contagion as one potential source of intergroup emotions. I will talk about intergroup conflicts, and then I will go to the extreme emotions. So, in classic emotion research and theorizing, emotions are always an individual thing. They are an individual state of mind. They have all kinds of components, like how you judge a certain situation, how you feel certain impulses in a situation, all the physiological changes that are there. And so it is basically an individualistic perspective, which sort of makes sense. However, the point is that most emotions, and I'm talking about 90% of the emotions, takes place in a social setting. So they are either elicited by another person or another group, or they take place in situations in which there are other people present. So you could say it is also a social phenomenon. And the question then is, how does this social context influence emotions? How can we conceptualize that better? So there are 2 ways in which emotions can be seen as part of a group. On the one hand, we talk about group-based emotions, and that means that you feel an emotion and feel emotional tendencies because of your membership of a certain group. So if you're a Metallica fan, then you're very proud and very happy if you're in a festival where they play. And sad if they can't play because of thunder and lightning and so on and so on. The more you identify with that group, the stronger your emotions can be. So the more important the group is, the stronger you would feel angry if the group is unjustly treated, the stronger you feel sad if the group cannot play or falls apart or whatever. The only difference, the only sort of reverse effect you can see when we're talking about shame or guilt, because in those situations it's the less you identify with a certain group, the less shame and the more shame and guilt you feel when the group does something that is sort of transgressing a social rule. But the general rule is identification matters, so the more salient your group membership is, the stronger it affects the emotions. So that's one thing. Another way in which we can think about emotions in a group is when they are experienced in a group. So you can have a group-based emotion when you're alone watching television or listening to something or reading something. You can have an emotion when you're alone. But if it's collectively experienced, if there are other people present, if you're in a group or in a crowd, then that might also influence what you feel and how you feel it and how you express it. So that's about the presence of other people. So these are two ways in which you can conceptualize how group settings may influence the individual emotions that you feel. So there are two important functions if you talk about group emotions. On the one hand, they preserve your group identity. The more emotions you can feel on the basis of your group identity, the stronger the identity becomes. So it's a sort of ongoing reciprocal influence. And it also strengthens the goals that you have with the group. So the more the emotions are a sort of motor, is a sort of motor for group-based action. And of course, this may also come at the expense of another group. So if there is some sort of tension between two groups, then feeling positive emotions about your own group is very often related to negative emotions about the other group. Especially if it's a sort of competition, like in politics or in sports, but also if there are some sort of tensions. And so in those cases you might feel Schadenfreude if the other group does something stupid or has bad luck or whatever. You may feel Schadenfreude, or you may just feel proud of your own group and therefore contempt, derogation for the other group. So these feelings often, for your own group and the other group, often go together. So one route to emotions that occur in an interaction, and that can be either with another person or with a person who is a group member, or just with several persons, is that you imitate very unconsciously and very automatically emotions of other people. And that's what has been referred to as primitive emotional contagion. And so the emotions that are felt within a group are sort of, spreading across different group members, and this spreading actually is based on the fact that we very automatically and fast imitate each other's expressions. So if you see someone suffer from pain, then you automatically also have a similar facial expression if you empathize with that person. If someone yawns, then that also is very easily mimicked. These are expressions that have been shown to be mimicked very easily. If someone smiles, the same happens. So you easily start smiling when another person smiles at you. So the function of this emotional mimicry is actually smoothing the interactions with another person. So if you're having an interaction and someone has a sort of blank face, then you suddenly just notices that something strange is happening, you know, and so the fact that someone is empathizing, listening, and so on and so on can be seen on the face without us being aware of that. I should emphasize that. However, there are boundaries towards this mimicry. Even though it's very automatic and it's very fast, there are boundaries. So previous research has shown that in some conditions we mimic more. For instance, if we are socially excluded from a group and we want to join the group. So if you think that another person, for instance, doesn't like you that much, but you want the other person to like you more, then you're starting to mimic this other person to a greater extent than when you just know that the other person likes you. Also, we mimic our enemies or competitors to a lesser extent than our friends and the people we work with. So a general positive or negative attitude is likely to influence the extent to which we mimic. So even, in this type of research, it has been shown that if you show people videos of avatars who display certain emotions, they smile or they frown, for instance, and if you get information about the avatar that this person has a bad character and all that, then we tend to mimic the smiling to a lesser extent, and the frowning also to a lesser extent than when we think this is a very good person, even if it's an avatar. So these are the boundaries of emotional mimicry. So the question then is, would that also apply to the idea that there's an in-group, which is your own group, it can be a very different group, but that's what we call the in-group in social psychology, and there's an out-group, other groups that you don't feel you belong to. Would it also be different in terms of mimicry? Would we mimic in-group members more than out-group members, even if we don't know them? So we did a study in which we examined whether we would mimic more towards in-group people or out-group people. And in this study, we based that actually upon a previous study in which it was shown that people judge the fear expressions of out-group more negatively than the fear expressions of in-groups. And also they judge the smiling of an in-group more positive than the smiling of an out-group. So there seems to be a difference. We wanted to examine whether this would also be the case with mimicry. So we had participants view happy, fearful, and angry faces. And these were very short videos in which a face starts being neutral and then it starts smiling or expressing a fearful or angry face. So it's like this. Or so very short video clips. But because they are dynamic, it's easier to investigate mimicry, because if you just see a photo, it's just a sort of one-shot thing. So we manipulated in-group and out-group by telling the participants in one condition that they were viewing economy students, and they were themselves psychology students, and in the other condition that they were viewing psychology students. So in-group, a very simple in-group, out-group manipulation, and we know that they really see economy students as an out-group. They are very different, of course. So the results, can you see this? Yeah? Okay, so the results, we measured the facial expressions of the participants on the basis of facial EMG. And we actually had two different ones. Well, I would talk about two different ones. The wrinkling of the eyes, which in technical terms is AU Action Unit 6. And the frowning, like this, Action Unit 4. So, anger is characterized by Action Unit 4. So if you see more of Action Unit 4, there's more mimicry of that particular facial expression. So here you see that people mimic the frowning of the in-group more than the frowning of the out-group. And they were exactly the same faces. So we just said this is the in-group and this is the out-group, but the faces were exactly the same. For fear, we also got an effect. Also more frowning, you could say, well, is this really mimicry? And I'm the first to criticize that, because there is some frowning in fear, but fear is actually characterized by a lot more facial action units, but you cannot measure so many different facial muscles with EMG. So that's why we had only the frowning. There was no difference for the smiling. So the participants didn't smile more in reaction to the smiling of the in-group versus the out-group. I'll come back to that. Is this clear? So we did a second study. Same emotions, angry, fearful, and happy faces, but we use different models. We have a dynamic stimulus set, facial stimulus set with these videos, and we have both very Dutch, white, blonde people, but also people from Turkey and Morocco and so on. So these, we call here the non-Caucasian models, and that's the outgroup for most of the psychology students. And we told them that we were interested in whether they were able to recognize, maybe differently, native models versus non-native Dutch models. And we asked them that, we did that in order for them to be sure that they were attending the faces very accurately. So they had to rate which emotion they saw on the face. And we videotaped the participants so that we could later on code the facial expressions that they showed.
Sorry, so their chance was to say native Dutch versus non-native Dutch?
I think we used a different term. So yeah, that's always a problem. But we carefully said something like individuals who were originally from the Netherlands, whose parents were from the Netherlands.
So it's like ethnicity basically, so it's just I'm just getting my head around what the task was. They basically they're discriminating on ethnicity. So that's what
yeah. So what they, it could be that they paid more attention to one or the other, but we didn't say that we assumed that one type of face would be recognized better. So we just did that in order to give them a sort of context of different ethnic groups. But they got one type of face in one condition and the other type of face in the other condition. So this is the action unit 4. That would be mimicry of anger, as we saw. This is actually fear. So here you have the, this is the mimicry of fear. The mimicry of joy you can basically do with 2 action units, the smiling and the wrinkling of the eyes. And now we had one other interesting facial action unit, which is contempt / disgust. That's the pulling up of the nose, like this. And we did that because in other studies it has been found that people may react with such a contempt reaction towards powerless displays of an outgroup. You know, an outgroup is showing fear, and then you might look down at this other group. And looking down can be reflected in the wrinkling of the nose. So if you look, this sort of, I've split it in 2. So if you look at the angry displays, then the mimicry of angry is showing action unit 4, frowning. So what you see is that there's a lot more frowning towards the in-group. Same as in the other study. If you look at the fear displays, then action unit 5, the widening of the eyes, is much more, well, it's not much, it's a marginal difference, I should say that. There's a lot of variation. But there's a tendency that the participants display more action unit 5 in reaction to fear of the in-group. Again, the smiling and laughter is not significant. But what you see over here is that people display more contempt on their face when looking at out-group fear rather than in-group fear. So here, you could call that a divergent reaction. It's actually a negative reaction towards the out-group. We also had a measure of liking. So we asked people to what extent they liked the person that they saw on the photo. Of course, they don't know this person, they just have to do some sort of guess. And what you see is, first of all, that they liked in-group members better than out-group members. So the ethnic in-group was liked better than the ethnic out-group. However, that was, I'm going to do this slowly but surely. So look at this lower part of the model. So ethnic group, whether they saw ethnic in-group or out-group faces, related to whether they liked the person or not, but that was mediated by the extent to which they mimicked this person. So the more they mimicked, the more they liked the person. And because they mimicked the in-group members more than the out-group members, that had an effect on the liking. But this was only the case, and that's why emotion comes in, it's only the case for negative emotions and not for positive emotions. So what happens for the positive emotions? Actually, what we found, so that there's no effect, whereas we expected there would be an effect, that has been found in other studies as well. And so we think it's an explanation that smiling is easier. It has a low social cost, so to say. So you smile so easily towards another person that it doesn't matter anymore whether it's an in-group or an out-group. That's the only explanation that we have. So it's a sort of ceiling effect. You smile because it's a smile is usually a very clear signal of affiliation or friendliness. And if you don't know someone, then you can easily respond to that. If you would know the person, or if you see that the smile is malicious or something like that, then of course it would be another issue. but we don't know that. There's not much research on that.
Sorry to jump in again.
Yeah.
In your coding of the action units, is it just literally a coding of the unit becoming active, or does it include the amplitude of the action?
It's the intensity.
It's the intensity.
Yeah.
So why would you not see something then? I've heard the explanation for joy before, and Ursula Hess has a very similar paper with.
Sorry.
Ursula Hess has a very similar paper with in and out. Groups in basketball versus non-basketball, and they use the same explanation as another organization.
Yeah, I discussed that with her. So that's why we have the same explanation.
I don't disagree about the explanation about the low cost of mimicking joy, but you would expect that if you have the amplitude or the intensity, that you would still see a correlation anyway. Would you not expect to see? Would you not expect to see joy being predictive of liking anyway, just on the basis of how much you mimic, even if it doesn't?
I would, but I didn't find it.
You just hit ceiling.
Yeah. So, I think, no, I completely agree. I don't have a good explanation for that, actually.
It's interesting if it comes out again, and that's nice.
Yeah. So, I think it might be different if you know someone. But again, you would expect that it would have an effect on liking, but you know, in this model it shouldn't, because there is no relationship between mimicry and liking, because there's no relationship between group and mimicry for the positive emotion, so it can be a mediator or a moderator in that respect. Okay. More questions? So the conclusion of this research is that there are subtle and automatic differences in how we respond to other people's faces. That you even have sort of divergent facial reaction towards the powerless displays of fear towards an outgroup. That mimicry mediates the differences in liking, the mimicry of negative emotions, I should say, and that smiling is a special case. I'll leave us with that. Okay, so talking about facial expressions and emotions in intergroup conflicts, there are some other lines of research that are interesting in that respect. Just to mention that how facial reactions, although they are very subtle, can play a role in those in sort of escalating conflict. And so, for instance, because they are very important social signals, they play a role in all kinds of interactions. And what we know from many different studies is that there is an in-group advantage in the recognition of emotions. So people are less able to recognize other outgroups' emotions. And according to Hilary Elfenbein and Abadi, this is because it's basically because we are more familiar with faces of our own group, so it's easier to recognize them because there are subtle differences in how different groups of people express their emotions, and so that makes us more accurate when interpreting the emotions of our in-group. Another line of research that we are doing ourselves, I'm not going into that here, but is the fact that we find that if you give people facial and emotional expressions, facial expressions, and you ask them how intense is this emotion, rather than which emotion is it, then people attribute less intensity to outgroup members' faces. So it means that they, or that's at least that's how we interpret it. It means that we empathize less, or are less able to simulate, take the perspective of another person, and therefore we see the other person's emotions as less strong, less intense. And as an implication, it may mean that we also pay less attention to those faces or those persons, we empathize less, we care less. I'm not sure whether, I mean, this is a bit of speculation how that could work, but given that emotional signals are quite important in lots of interactions, this could have impact. So, in other words, facial expressions actually do not help in improving social bonds once we have categorized someone else as an out-group member rather than an in-group member. So obviously more things should happen when there is a tension or a conflict between groups. It's not only facial expressions, but they help you making this distinction or maintaining the distinction between in-group and out-group. So I'm going to talk about extreme emotions. That is not actually a word that has been used so often in the emotion literature, but I don't know what else to call it. So normal emotions have a short duration, and that has been investigated for many times. If you ask people about their emotions, and if you ask them how long did it take, well, normally it doesn't take that longer than a quarter of an hour. And sometimes it can be very long, but most of the time it's relatively short. And so what are extreme emotions, in my view? They are based either on one extreme event, like a bombing or a divorce or someone who died, or those types of events, or an accumulation of events that are not necessarily that strong, each of them, but because it has accumulated, it can become quite traumatic, and the reaction towards these events are towards the sum of these events. So if someone treats you unfairly once, you can be angry. If someone has treated you unfairly for years, then anger doesn't work anymore. So you might change your anger into indifference, contempt, hate, feelings of revenge, and so on. So that's what I mean with an accumulation of events. So if you think about these extreme emotions, they are often long-lasting. And whereas in short-term emotions, one of the components is that you appraise a certain event or a certain stimulus in a way, but in long-term emotions there seems to be a sort of permanent change of the target or the object of the emotion. So let me give an example. I'll just do this first. So the example of contempt versus anger, in which contempt can be seen as a more extreme emotion in comparison with anger. So if you look at appraisals that are characteristic of anger, it means that you are unfairly treated. But you have the feeling when you're angry that you can change the other person, that you can say something in order to make this person say that he's sorry or regret it or whatever. So you feel in control. You blame the other person because you think the person could have done it differently. The goal of anger is change and forcing the other person to do something differently. The action tendency is attack, so either criticizing a person, attacking in what way. You can do that in many different ways. And the actual social long-term effect of anger is reconciliation. So you're making up because the other person says sorry. There is some sort of reconciliation in the long term. It's not part of the anger, but an effect of the anger. And that is not the case for contempt. So contempt always involves also a lot of anger. But rather than blaming someone for a certain act, there is an blame in terms of that this person is bad, so that the whole person actually is bad. Not only one action or one behavior, but you just think this person is inferior and not worth your attention. And the goal, therefore, is to exclude this person. You don't want to have to do anything with that person anymore. You want to derogate the person, and the ultimate social effect is rejection. So, contempt actually, if you look at interpersonal relations, when there's contempt, and when the contempt lasts, which is sort of typical, then that's a sign of divorce. Being angry is not a predictor of divorce, but contempt is. So this is the difference in terms of short and long-term emotions. I wanted to say something about the moral nature of extreme emotions. So there's a lot of discussion about whether emotions are moral or not, and according to lots of people, both anger and contempt are moral emotions in the sense that they imply the transgression of rules, rules of autonomy, of rights, of fairness, of community, and so on. That makes us either angry or contemptuous. And the moral emotions in that sense have the goal or the function to preserve these moral values that we all have. If we wouldn't feel angry or if we wouldn't feel contempt towards the person transgressing those moral rules, then, you know, we would be nowhere. And so this is one of the reasons why extreme emotions can also be seen as moral in nature, because they make us act upon the goals and the rules that have been transgressed. So, okay. So a little bit more about contempt. I did a study on contempt in interpersonal relationships, so not in intergroup, but I think you can apply it to groups as well. And in which we actually found that the more angry someone has been, and the more ineffective the anger has been. So you become angry, but it doesn't help anything. The person doesn't change. Then there is a likelihood that that we feel contempt. And so you also, it's easier to feel contempt in all kinds of relations with other persons in which you don't feel some sort of commitment with the other person, because that's gone. So people feel more anger in intimate relations than contempt. And of course, because the contempt is also a predictor of divorce, that makes a sort of sense. But it is you can see contempt as a form of anger regulation, actually, because you don't want to be angry all the time. It's better to just, you know, ignore the person, exclude the person. Don't let this person interfere with your life, and don't let this person get you upset and angry all the time. So, and the same happens with groups. I mean, if you're very angry at a certain group in your society, or a group that you have to engage with all the time, then if the group doesn't change, it's easier for you, and it's less effortful to ignore that group and put the group down to where they belong, in your view. So, contempt is one extreme emotion. Humiliation is another one. Does anyone have questions about contempt? Sorry. Okay, so humiliation has been described as a deep, disparate feeling of being put down, being degraded, and being ridiculed by another person. And we've done some research in Amsterdam. It should be dosje, by the way, not dosje. And we found that if you describe humiliating scenarios in two different conditions, so between subject conditions, in one you add a laughing audience, and in another you just say nothing about the audience. So a scenario like this, you're participating in a discussion on politics. There are participants from different backgrounds. At one point the discussion turns to a sensitive topic for some people. The discussion leader happens to be aware that you know a lot about the topic, therefore he asks you a question about it. When you hesitate a little to answer the question, the person who sits next to you says in a sneering tone, if you're not even able to give an honest and open opinion, then what are you doing here? Just, you know, it's a little humiliating, maybe a little bit derogatory. But then we added, then some of the other participants started to laugh. In the other condition, we mentioned the other participants, but they were sort of neutral. And what you see then is that people, we have done this with many different scenarios, but all the time you feel more humiliation, also more shame and anger in the laughing condition. So this is another example of how social context makes some emotions more intense. It has been argued by several people that humiliation is good for the group bonding. And so, especially in Western societies, humiliation is part of the initiation rituals in, for instance, student organizations. And the idea is that if people are humiliated, then it is good for their becoming a member of the group. Their commitment will be better. The shared experience of victimhood will give them a sort of idea that they belong to this group and that they have done everything to be part of it, and therefore they like the group more. So it would mean that humiliation has a function in group bonding. Well, we have examined that idea, and we examined the role of humiliation in initiation rituals. In the first study, we asked people about about their experiences with an initiation ritual. We asked them several questions about the severity, the amount of humiliation they felt, and whether they felt affiliated with the person they were with, actually their fellow students. And what you see is that the more severe the initiation, the less affiliation they report among their fellow students. And that is actually mediated by so the relation between mental severity and affiliation is mediated by humiliation. Then we did another study because when people described the initiation event, they actually said that when they were alone it was worse than when they were together. And so we did an experiment in which we had two conditions, actually three conditions. One in which a person was humiliated on his own, one in the group, and one sort of control condition. And what they had to do is they had to dance in a group. You know, dancing, if you can, especially if you can't dance, but for everyone, dancing is can be a very humiliating experience. And so what they had to do is we asked them to dance in a group of 4 persons, and 2 were confederates and 2 were actual participants. And it was a dance on African music, and we said that group performance will influence subsequent tasks. That's what we will be investigating. And the goal of your group is to move as if you were one, and to synchronize as best as you can. And then the manipulation was that after 5 minutes the Confederates stopped the whole thing, stopped the music and said, oh, please stop it, it's going wrong. And either one person was picked out of the group and said, you're not doing very well, you're not in line with the rest, or the whole group was humiliated. And then afterwards we measured humiliation, affiliation, and social support. And what you see if you look at the measures of humiliation, but also tendency to avoid or the tendency to attack, is that humiliation is highest when you are humiliated alone, as one person, rather than in a group. And this was actually mediated by social support. So that's not in here, but the more social support was felt in the group situation, and that social support actually mediated the fact that they felt less humiliation and less tendency to avoid in the group situation. So actually the feeling that others are sharing this experience with you helps people. So in conclusion, humiliation becomes more intense when others love, when the humiliation is at the heart of one's identity. That was found in different types of vignettes. When you're humiliated as a person, as an individual, rather than a group member. And what happens actually, so the question is, when you're talking about intergroup emotions, the question is, what happens when people are humiliated a lot more? Not just once, but one time after another. Then you would get all kinds of more extreme emotions like revenge, hate, etc., etc. I think I'll leave it with that. I have some stuff on hate, but that's sort of preliminary. So I want to conclude with the fact that that emotions do play a very important role, I think, in all kinds of intergroup situations, and that you can start studying these emotions by just looking at facial expressions, but that if you want to look at more extreme emotions, you'll have to go to self-reports in different types of situations, because you cannot evoke, you can hardly evoke extreme emotions in the lab. So I'll leave it with that.
I was just wondering if you control the people's mood before they look at the videos of other people, because obviously if you've got a cohort, if you've got some people in there who are feeling quite sad or angry anyway, or quite happy, I'm just wondering if you were controlling for the starting mood of the participant.
Yeah, I think controlling, if people come to our lab, they usually have a happy mood. So if we, I mean, we have done it quite some time, and if you look at the scale from 1 to 7, it's more or less 5. So you could look at the effect of mood by manipulating it and making people grumpy, sad, or whatever, and that would certainly have an effect. There is other research showing that if people are in a bad mood, they react more negatively to displays of others' facial expressions. So yeah.
Thank you.
I wonder if you're going linking contempt back to the trying to talk about facial movement stuff. Whether if your hypothesis is that once you move from anger into contempt, actually the emotion of the other person becomes less valued, it's therefore presumably less contagious as well. Whether actually if you can find a single group of stimuli that represent the contemptuous group, whether that actually provides you an interesting experiment to test your hypothesis of emotion contagion.
Very good idea. Yeah. No, I mean, I think that should be the case. So it's it is a bit difficult to get people into a really contemptuous mood
state, that's right.
without and getting permission of the ethical committee.
Yeah.
But if they would be, then they should, they should just react indeed to a lesser extent to facial expressions. I think maybe in general, but even more for the person whom they have been angry with beforehand.
Yeah.
So yeah, I think it's a very good hypothesis, but
just logistically, it's also
yeah.
I've got a question as well. What if you're tied or trapped in a structural relationship that you cannot change? So, say you feel anger or contempt towards your employer.
Yeah.
You can't just divorce yourself, and economic situation says there are not enough jobs, so you're stuck.
Yeah.
What happens then?
You
What happens after contempt?
Oh, but you can ignore that person. I mean, you can sort of. So the first step would be to indeed try to ignore the person as much as possible. If that doesn't work, I actually think that you get feelings of revenge. And so feelings of revenge are sort of imagination of what you could do to this person in order to pay back whatever he did to you.
Would there be any health implication? I mean, for the
Health.
person experiencing contempt? Well-being.
It massive increases in cortisol if you're carrying around anger every day.
Well, it should be better. I think contempt is, because I see contempt also as a form of regulation. I think it's better to feel contempt at some point without any anger anymore than just being angry all the time. But I don't know whether people can do that. Because if I've done several studies on contempt, and always when you ask people about contempt, they also report a lot of anger. So I think you can feel contempt without anger for groups that you don't know. So there's this research on stereotypes about different types of groups. So for instance, beggars or what people of whom you think they have very low standing and low class and nothing interesting, then you can feel contempt towards the group, and that not necessarily involves any anger. So I think in that sense you have two different forms of contempt.
Because what happens to the anger and the contempt after they've served their purpose? So presumably you start feeling angry, you try and change the person won't change, you feel contemptuous towards them, that might end in divorce. But then, I don't know, you quite often see that people still feel very angry and contemptuous towards the person after they've divorced them. So what purpose does that then serve after you've already ended the relationship?
I actually think they feel more contempt. They can still feel contempt. If the contempt can only stop if another part of yourself says, well, he cannot help it, or she. And so maybe I should try to look at this person differently. But if most of the time you still have to deal with that person even after a divorce, and then it can still feed your feelings of contempt, I think. But I'm just speculating, because there's not that much work on those long-term implications.
The narcissist is more contemptuous. The narcissists show reduced facial mimicry.
I guess so.
And be quick to be just like, well, this person is not me, therefore.
Yeah. Well, some people are, people's personality makes it more likely that they have some emotions more than other emotions. And so if you are arrogant, or then it's likely that you feel more contempt, or you're more easily contemptuous. And also, if you're dominant, you will be more likely to be angry. If you're depressed, then it's more likely that you will be sad and things. So I think there's a relationship between certain personality characteristics and the likelihood that you interpret events in terms of this. Yeah.
So yes.
All right, thanks very much.